If you could keep yourself on mute throughout the event, unless you were speaking, that'd be brilliant, just to reduce background noise as far as possible. If you do want to ask a question, please use the raise hand function and then introduce yourself. And after you've asked your question, if you could pop yourself back on mute, that'd be great. And if you do have any technical problems, if you just wait to see whether the call restarts itself, but otherwise, if you click back on the Zoom link for this call again, then that should sort it out. Okay, so let's continue with why we're all here today, which is to discuss the Open for Business report. This report, written by Jamie Wylie. Jamie, if you'd like to give us a wee wave there. This report investigates a case study of Oslo, which introduced one of Europe's largest car-free city centres between 2017 and 2019. It looks at what went well in gaining support from businesses for the scheme, what didn't go so well, and what other cities can learn from this. Oslo and other continental European cities are leading the way in transforming city centres and reducing the dominance of cars in their streets. And we can and should look at these examples to see what is possible and what we could aspire to for our own Scottish towns and cities. We've seen some very positive changes already over the past year, and there are a number of other schemes underway, but we've also seen that businesses do not necessarily support these schemes, so understanding how we can secure buy-in from businesses to make car-free city centres a success is crucial. We're really pleased today to be joined by former Transform Scotland team member Jamie Wylie, who wrote the report and is now working for the Solar Impulse Foundation in Switzerland, alongside Daly, Head of Communications and Policy at Sustrans Scotland, Gareth Williams, Head of Policy at the Scottish Council for Development and Industry, SCDI, and Lesley Macinnes, convener of the Transport and Environment Committee at Edinburgh City Council. So Jamie will first be giving a presentation on the report, and then we'll hear about the Scottish context for transforming city centres from Gareth, Lesley and Cllr. After that, we'll have a question and answer session where you can ask the speakers your questions. So get thinking about what questions you'd like to ask at that point. We'll aim to close the session for 5 to 12. For now, I'll hand you over to Jamie.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Rachel. I'm just going to share my screen before I get going. Great. Yeah, fantastic. So yeah, lovely to see a lot of familiar faces on the call and some new ones as well. As Rachel said, my name's Jamie, formerly of Transform Scotland, now live in Switzerland, although currently back in Scotland to hopefully watch Scotland win the Euros, but we'll see what happens. To give some context to this report, this was carried out in fulfillment of my master's thesis back in 2019, and I undertook this research in a very sunny and warm Scandinavian summer in 2019. So it's important to note that things have progressed since this research was carried out, but I think a lot of valuable lessons to be learned from this research. So I want to start with the question is, what kind of city do we really want to live in? And this is a question which a lot of cities are obviously asking themselves, particularly in the context of what we've seen with COVID-19. And I think we have a fundamental choice. We can continue with business as usual, where our streets are all too often dominated by vehicles, our air is polluted, our roads are congested, and we can't really enjoy the cities in which we live. Or we can start to shift to places which are designed for people, where people have priority over vehicles, where we build attractive and successful cities, where people can really enjoy the places in which they live. And thankfully, this is a question which a lot of cities across Europe and indeed across the world are starting to ask now. And there's a lot of great examples at the moment, in particular, of cities across Europe which are aiming to do just this, kind of create people-first cities where our city centres are built for people, attractive city centres, successful city centres. And I'm sure a lot of you will have seen a lot of cases in the media of places like Paris recently, Barcelona, Milan, the ever-present examples of Copenhagen and Amsterdam. And I'm pleased to say, closer to home, Glasgow and Edinburgh now setting really kind of ambitious targets to redesign our city centres to put people first. And I think it's important to note that this isn't just about transport and creating an efficient transport system or tackling climate change. And it very much is about those things, but it's also about creating attractive and successful and resilient city centres as well. Obviously, for the purpose of this report, I chose to focus on Oslo. So I'll give you some context here. So going all the way back to 2015, there was an election, local election, which saw kind of a three-party coalition elected in the local authority there, crucially including the Green Party, who in their manifesto set out an ambition to create a car-free city centre in Oslo. And when they were elected, changes started to be made fairly rapidly after that. So, as I said, they were elected, and this actually enabled these plans to become not just an ambition, but reality. So in 2017, the project started to develop. And very quickly, what we saw was it was a transition away from a car-centric environment towards a people-centric environment. So in 2017, we saw the removal of parking spaces, and that continued right through to 2019 and beyond. I think over 700 parking spaces removed in total during this time frame. Also in 2017 and 2018, the trialing of these measures as well. So I think there was 6 kind of areas where measures were trialed to see what was working, how they could create a more attractive city centre, more public seating, more green space, trying to learn from that experience. Then looking towards 2019, this was when more of the sort of main measures were introduced. So more parking removal, reallocation of road space away from cars towards public transport, and of course to walking and cycling, and creating more attractive space in the city centre. And that involved public realm improvements. So more seating, more greenery, more plants and that sort of thing. Play areas, public toilets, water fountains, things like that, to really kind of create an environment in which people wanted to spend time. And it's also important to note that that has continued since, in the time since this report was carried out, and we can maybe come to that at the end. So what does that look like in practice? Well, this is just a few pictures I took during my time in Oslo, and I think these just help to demonstrate what we're really talking about here. It's not complex, it's not expensive measures, it's really kind of simple, easy to do measures which make a big difference to create a more attractive environment in the city centre. So things like spaces for outdoor seating, which is enabled by reducing car access, more public seating in kind of big squares and that sort of thing. Simple things like putting planters down to kind of give more space to people and create an attractive environment as well. And I think if you looked at this from the outside rather, it would be easy to think that this was some sort of car-free utopia. And I think we're often guilty of looking to Scandinavia as some sort of utopia, and that was also the case with the car-free project in Oslo. So we saw lots of positive headlines from international media like this. But when we looked a little bit closer, we obviously saw that there was another side to this, and some quite extreme headlines, which maybe wouldn't look out of place in some of our newspapers in Scotland. So what we saw is obviously there was another side to this, and there was some local opposition occurring, and in particular from the business community as well. And this is something we see time and time again, is opposition from the business community reflected in the media. And I thought back in 2019 that this made a really interesting point to focus on, is we often see this opposition highlighted to initiatives which are trying to reduce car use in cities. This is obviously really important because businesses are rightly so a very important stakeholder in decision-making processes when it comes to political decisions in cities. But there was perhaps little understanding of what concerns were leading to that opposition and why this opposition was arising. So I kind of asked the question of how can we actually understand this opposition and overcome this opposition as well. Briefly to touch on the sort of research focus of my research. I sadly don't have time to go into all these aspects, but just to try and highlight the key things I was looking into here. So firstly, what were the main concerns expressed by business stakeholders in Oslo towards the car-free project? How justified were these concerns? So to what extent were these concerns based in reality? Or were there other factors in play? And thirdly, and most importantly, what actions can local authorities actually take to address these concerns and make these projects work well for businesses? And just to highlight the kind of key ways I did this, first of all, a literature review to assess previous work done on this topic. Most importantly, interviews with people on the ground, so business owners, business organizations, and local authority employees in Oslo, trying to paint a picture of what had happened in Oslo. and also looking at policy documents from the local authority to assess how they had tried to take into account business in the car-free project, what support was being offered, and what measures had been taken to help businesses, and listen to their views. So as I said, I sadly don't have time to talk about the full range of the report, but I hope if you go and read the report, you can get a full picture. So what I'm going to do here is just kind of highlight some of the key concerns that were raised, or I found kind of stated by the business community. So firstly, and this is all based on my discussions with, as I said, business owners, business organisations, and the local authority as well, to try and paint a full picture and get both sides of the story, really. So what I found is that there was a sense amongst the business community that there was perhaps little direct engagement with individual business owners on the ground at the kind of coalface of these projects, and that a lot of consultation and collaboration had been done with business organisations, which is great, but perhaps the direct engagement and hearing the views from individual business owners, perhaps that was lacking. And indeed, when the views of business owners were heard, there was some feeling that perhaps there was a lack of flexibility on the side of the local authority to actually make changes as a result of that feedback. Now, when I spoke to the local authority about this, there was a recognition that perhaps there had been a lack of engagement throughout the project with individual business owners, particularly at the start. And indeed, there was perhaps a lack of feedback from the local authority to explain what changes were actually being made as a result of the engagement with business owners, and perhaps that had contributed to some of this ill feeling. It's important to note that there were some actual successes of hearing the views of businesses and making changes, in particular when it comes to making arrangements and changes for delivery access for businesses in the city centre. Secondly, communication, and I'd say this one and consultation were the two kind of biggest concerns I identified. So firstly, there was a feeling amongst business stakeholders that there was perhaps a lack of clarity about what the municipality was really trying to achieve with the project. So at the start, there was messaging about this being an environmentally based project, trying to reduce emissions and that sort of thing. And that messaging later shifted to be more about creating a more successful and attractive city centre. So I think there was a feeling that businesses perhaps just weren't really sure what the purpose of the project was, and that was maybe leading to some uncertainty about the real motivation for the project. Secondly, and more importantly, I would say, some business stakeholders said that there was a feeling of a lack of information about what changes were really going to take place on the street level to actually access on particular streets. And that's obviously a very legitimate concern if you have a business and you're not entirely sure what changes are going to be made outside your front door. So that's obviously a very legitimate concern. And indeed, perhaps a lack of communication meant that some business stakeholders felt that they were having to rely on the media to actually provide information on what was happening with the project. And as we know, that's potentially a dangerous thing or something which could lead to opposition, as media is not always a neutral and informative source on projects like this, which tend to be quite emotional. When I spoke to the local authority about this, again, there was an appreciation that there was perhaps a lack of clarity, particularly at the early stages of the project, with the messaging in terms of what they were trying to achieve and why they were doing it. And in particular, there was a recognition that there was a lack of a clear communication strategy from the outset to really kind of set the narrative, make sure people knew what was happening and why. Thirdly, economic impact. Now, this is something which obviously comes up time and time again in discussions around reducing car use, is what economic impact there will be on businesses and livelihoods. And it was the same case in Oslo. So there were claims of a negative economic impact occurring for certain shops. The premise being that these shops depended on people who were more likely to use cars to access their shops, perhaps an older clientele who were maybe more used to driving and actually owned cars as well. And this is just what they were used to doing. When I spoke to the municipality and indeed looked at kind of wider research that's been done on the impact of this project, I think overall, there's not enough really evidence to support this claim that there were economic losses. The research that's been done has shown that more people are visiting the city centre, and people are actually spending longer in the city centre as well. And there's not really any clear evidence of economic losses. I think, however, it's important to recognise this point and note that whilst in general these projects can really deliver economic benefits and benefit the city as a whole, it may be the case that in some circumstances, certain types of shops may not benefit as much as others. So I think it's still important to recognise this point. So that was just some of the main concerns that I identified. There were others, but for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to kind of reflect on these. So I think what I found overall with these three concerns I've identified and the other ones in the report is that most of the opposition was actually arising from how the project had been implemented and managed, rather than the actual premise of reducing car use. And even the most kind of fervent opponent to the project I spoke to, who was a business owner, he agreed that reducing car access in the city centre was a good thing from an environmental perspective, but he was frustrated with how the project had gone on the kind of implementation side of things. So I think what that means is that there's a strong need for kind of strong project organisation, making sure that on the side of the local authority, the right resources, the right management and the right strategy is in place to make sure these projects are well delivered. And I think overall, some of the concerns which I identified don't stand up to scrutiny, but there are some legitimate kind of concerns or complaints which are worth considering and thinking about how we can address those in future projects. And I think, and this might not come as a surprise, but I think the role of media, both kind of normal media and social media, still remains quite significant to the kind of public perception of these projects. So I think it's really important from the side of a local authority to kind of get in there early and try and set the narrative, make clear why you're doing the project, what's going to happen and how that's going to happen as well. So to touch on a few of the recommendations relating to the concerns specifically that I set out, again, there are more recommendations in the report, but just for the purpose of this, I've just chosen to highlight a few here. So when we talk about communication and promotion of the scheme, I think this is, as I've said earlier in the presentation, this is a really important point. So I think having a very clear communication strategy from the outset is absolutely vital. And just to reiterate that point, it allows you to kind of have a better chance of setting that narrative from the start. So making clear why you're doing the project, what changes are going to take place, what benefits there are going to be. And that leads me on to my second point here, which is making sure that the benefits of the project, so the tangible benefits that people can see on the street, so creating a more attractive urban environment, any economic benefits, things like that, trying to actually promote the benefits that will be delivered through the project is very, very important. I think documenting the change as you deliver these projects is also very important. I think when you're talking about a project that's delivered over 2, 3, 4 years, there's a sense that it's a never-ending project and you have to wait years for any benefits to be delivered. So I think highlighting those tangible things that are being done as they're done is very, very important. Moving on to consultation and collaboration, I think, and this won't come as a surprise, but I think close collaboration with individual business owners, actually, as I say, at the coalface of these projects is very, very important. Making sure that they know that their views are appreciated and that we're actually listening to these concerns as well. And again, showing some willingness to actually make changes as a result of their views and then letting them know that has been done and that their views are valued. Secondly, I think it's really crucial to build relationships with business organizations. Business organizations are obviously a very important actor in these discussions, and I think that can be a great way to kind of build a rapport with the business community as a whole. So that's something that was done in Oslo, and I think that seems to have worked well. And just to maybe highlight the point again is, I think showing some flexibility and responsiveness from the side of the local authority and showing that willingness to make changes where necessary. Again, that was done well in Oslo, particularly with things like the delivery changes which were made. I think the window for deliveries was extended, for example, although in other areas there could have been more flexibility to accommodate for businesses. In terms of project organisation, I think establishing a body to manage the project within the local authority is really, really important. And this needs to be well resourced, and there needs to be enough kind of financial backing and resource backing to make sure that this body has the ability to do what it needs. These are very complex projects drawing on lots of different parts of a local authority, and I think it's really important that you're able to actually have enough resources there, so you're able to do things like draw in the transport team, the kind of business team, whatever it might be from the local authority, and making sure that there's enough resources in place to make sure these projects are successful. Secondly, integrating kind of car-free city centre projects into the wider strategies for urban development, very, very important. So thinking about how do these projects tie into regional transport plans? How do they tie into economic plans for the development of the city? How can you kind of make sure that there's a joined up approach happening with the different plans within the local authority and the region? Just a final one recommendation here. I think it's really important to monitor the impact of these projects. I think there's multiple reasons for this, but I think one of the most important ones is that this allows you to then go to businesses or other stakeholders and say, these are the tangible benefits that are being delivered for the economy, or how long people are spending in the city centre. Being able to back up your arguments and prove and maybe dispel some of the myths about these projects, about the impact on the local economy, is really, really important. And I think trying as best as possible to monitor this impact is very important. And indeed, that's something that Oslo has done well, monitoring how long people are spending in the city centre, looking to ways to monitor the economic changes in the city as well. So just to finish up with a few kind of conclusions and reflections as a whole, I think what Oslo has shown is, I mean, the project as a whole, really, really commendable in terms of the level of ambition and the actions that have been undertaken. And I think what the city has shown is that meaningful action is possible in a short time scale, and that we often set these long-term goals for transforming cities, but I think Oslo has shown that can be done and you can make real change in a short time space. I think ultimately opposition to these projects is inevitable to some extent, but there are ways that we can minimize this, kind of hopefully stop some issues arising and overcome and convince people that these projects are the right thing to do for our cities. This next point isn't something I've been able to reflect on in great detail, but I think making sure that the urban or regional transport system for the city is strong enough to accommodate this reduction in car use. So Oslo is very lucky in that it has a fantastic public transport system. So great bus, tram and metro system in place. And that's obviously allowed an alternative to car use. So I think thinking about what changes are needed at the wider city level or the regional level to make sure that there are feasible, convenient and affordable alternatives in place is very important. And I think maybe just to finish off with a final point here, is that I think this is an opportunity for all of us, including businesses, to rethink what cities are really for. We know the economic landscape is changing rapidly, and businesses are obviously facing a range of challenges, not least with COVID. But we know that the old way of doing things is changing. You know, the ever-present things like online shopping, that's obviously causing big problems for businesses, and that has been the case for a long time. So I think what we need to do is think about how we can change our city centres to be more than just places to shop, but places to enjoy and spend time. And there are clear, obvious benefits for all of us, including businesses, in this regard. Now, obviously, I completed this research back in 2019, and that is a long time ago. So I just wanted to finish off with maybe what has changed in Oslo since then. So this, as I said, was the initial project, and that was able to be completed because of this coalition which had an ambition to do this. During the elections in 2019, the Greens did very, very well and are part of the local government again, and that has allowed them to go further in Oslo. And when I was doing research about what has changed since I did my research, I'm very pleased to say that these plans have expanded, and my local knowledge of Oslo is definitely not as good as the two people we have from Oslo on the call today. But this project's obviously expanding out massively, and I think kind of moving into slightly more residential areas as well. So posing new challenges, but more opportunities as well. So it's fantastic to see this level of ambition in Oslo. They've done a fantastic project, and I think a lot of lessons that can be learned for Scottish cities as well. So that concludes my my presentation, and yeah, looking forward to hearing your thoughts and answering any questions you have. So thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Jamie. I saw the end quote there, people shop, cars don't. Seems a good one to end on. Thanks very much for your presentation. A very clear and interesting synopsis of your research and findings. So I'm now going to bring in our team of panelists for some brief responses to your presentation. Afterwards, we will open the floor to any questions you might have for Jamie, Gareth, Cllr, or Lesley on this topic. But for now, I'd like to hand over to Gareth Williams from SCDI, as one of Scotland's leading business representative groups, to start off this discussion from within the Scottish context.
Thanks very much. Thanks to Transform Scotland for the invitation to speak and to be part of this interesting report. SCDI it can offer a view from business, but we're not a business organisation, and we like to think we can offer a broad perspective on issues such as this one. I thought what I might do is just start with our new policy blueprint, Making a Good Living, which is our vision and 10-year economic strategy for Scotland. Partly because that's been all that's filled my head for the last 6 months, and partly because it's based on exceptional, certainly for us, engagement with our members. So it'd give you a strong idea of how our members would approach discussions about car-free city centres. I think the title itself, Making a Good Living, is a fair summary. We think a more productive and prosperous Scottish economy is essential, but this must be compatible with social inclusion and environmental sustainability. In fact, these are all increasingly interdependent as we think about the future success of the Scottish economy. The blueprint is based on 4 themes: Scotland's economic purpose, a living lab for innovations, learning throughout life, and healthy places to live and work. And under these 4 themes, there are 12 main recommendations. And I'll briefly touch on some of them, which are relevant to our discussion today. Scotland's economic purpose covers purposeful businesses, productivity and wellbeing, and internationalisation. So we believe that Scottish businesses are increasingly viewing profitably solving the problems of people and planet, locally and globally, as core to what they do. So that will inform their thinking about car-free city centres, and it's obviously relevant to gaining business support for transforming city centres. And as I've highlighted, we believe improvements in productivity and health and quality of life must be linked and can no longer be compartmentalised. Turning to a living lab for innovations, under that comes clean growth, the foundational economy, and innovation neighbourhoods. It won't surprise you that when we asked the question, what should Scotland aim to be known for in the global economy of 2030, our members overwhelmingly said that being a living lab for clean growth should be the highest priority. Again, I think that reinforces the potential to gain support for car-free city centres. The foundational economy, that describes parts of the private, public and third sectors of the economy that provide essential services on which people most rely in their everyday lives. So that includes sectors like retail, hospitality and tourism, which are strong in city centres. And the last year has shown us the importance of these sectors and their workforces for our economy and society. So that really reinforces the need for them to be at the heart of plans for car-free city centres from the outset. And finally, under Living Lab for Innovations, we proposed a new generation of innovation ecosystems to catalyse place-based net zero growth called innovation neighbourhoods, and we see these as hubs for entrepreneurship and collaboration between businesses and education. We would envisage that some of these would be located in or near city centres. And as Jamie said, and the report makes clear that car-free city centres must therefore be part of the wider local economic development strategies. The recommendations under learning throughout life are maybe more distant related to car-free city centres, but the blueprint does highlight Scotland's demographic challenges and a need to be attractive to people to live and work if we're to retain and attract the leaders, managers and key skills that our economy needs and be competitive in the so-called international war for talent. Lastly, healthy places to live and work covers digital, housing and renewing places and spaces. A relevant point to note here is the chapter didn't have healthy in the title originally, although it was very much featured in our discussions. However, the value of health and resilience have come at the forefront over the last year or so for Scottish businesses. With every challenge comes opportunity, and we believe that Scotland has a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to create prosperous, healthy, green and resilient economies, and with infrastructure, jobs, services, active travel and green spaces for people to live, work and play locally. And we strongly support the conversion of vacant properties for city and town centre living. In this chapter, it's where we highlight the potential for car-free city centres and the need for close work with local businesses and third sector organisations on plans. So that brings me back to the report, which we warmly welcome. It's incredibly helpful that Transport Scotland have asked the question how we can gain business support for car-free city centres. Communication and consultation have been major frustrations for businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic, and clearly anything which is perceived as a risk to economic recovery is going to require very sensitive handling. I think the report provides an excellent summary of the opportunities and challenges, which Jamie has just explained, and probably doesn't require me to say much more about them. All the recommendations make perfect sense for us. If there's one point that I'd emphasise, it's the involvement in the design of any local projects, not only the development. As we consulted on our blueprint, we didn't just hear this from businesses, but from a range of employers, including universities and colleges, public services and voluntary organisations. City centres are mixed economies with large anchor institutions and SMEs, and we need to engage them all. I also very much support the point about delivering improvements as early as possible and getting that sense of momentum behind the project. And if there's one point that I think perhaps is needing a little bit more emphasis, it's around the need for flexibility to respond to changing circumstances, with the last year showing us just how dramatically circumstances can change. I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussions.
That's great. Thanks for your comments there, Gareth. I think it's clear that communication is becoming a key theme here within this discussion. Claire, I was wondering if you'd like to come in at this point to give a short response to the report.
Sure, yeah. First of all, congratulations, Jamie. It's absolutely superb report. You won't take it as a bad thing to say that most of it was not a surprise, although there was some really, really interesting insights. And wouldn't it have been great if this report was available, 5 years ago or something like that? But it's really, really good because, of course, we keep hearing of Oslo as being this great, example. So I think injecting it with a dose of reality is really, really helpful. I just kind of jotted down some thoughts for myself, and of course, as what I think is important. I am head of policy and communications with Sustrans Scotland. However, I'd be drawing more on my experience as a corporate partnerships manager with a major arts organisation in Scotland, and previously experiences in management consultancy about implementing change. And yes, we're saying communication. I think very often, and I was kind of noting this even beforehand, We need to understand the difference fundamentally between marketing and business development. And what I mean by that is marketing communication. It's like if we just keep telling people, if we kind of package it nicely, if we have a nice PR campaign, then people will just come on board. And then we're surprised when that doesn't happen. Business development or engagement, if we would call it in policy circles or whatever, is that two-way communication, the sitting down, listening. Just as marketing supports your business development processes, likewise, your communications plans support your engagement. But it's not as easy to do. It's not as quick to do. But as Jamie's research has shown, it's vitally important to sit down with the businesses. And that was what I did find really interesting, Jamie, because I would have said, oh yeah, talk to the Chambers of Commerce, and talk to the Federations, Small Business and the business representative organizations. And then, you're 2/3 of the way there. But I think that's really interesting as well. It's not just talking to the representative organizations. You also need to engage with individual business owners. The other thing I would say, though, is understanding that distinction between, your good communication, your clear messages will support your engagement. But the most important thing is actually the engagement. And I love the bit about, the flexibility that you talk about, demonstrating flexibility, because people need to feel that there aren't winners and losers. If we keep doing this as a winners and losers thing, we've loads of examples, and I won't mention them because they're so controversial, but there's loads of areas, and you can say Brexit, independence, loads of other areas like that, where you've got one group that are absolutely, or cycling activism, where we are so convinced right and good is on our side, and all we have to do is just keep saying it. And very often what happens is that other groups get pilloried, they feel ignored, they feel compartmentalized. Do the concerns go away? No, they just disappear into a little kind of, whether it's a Facebook group, whether it's a quiet campaign, whether it's, and so bringing the, and that's what one-to-one engagement or small group engagement allows you to do. It allows you hear what the concerns are, be ready to address them, and be honest. And so that would be the main thing I would say. I would also think, just thinking about this and drawing on kind of management consultancy experience, if you can have some experts, and when I say experts in areas that businesses are concerned about, like logistics. And I think that was interesting, Jamie, as well, that you noted that, just giving a bit more flexibility on the delivery times opened up, opportunities and kind of got people more bought in with the idea, but also communicating in terms that business understands and the business agrees with, so again, going back to that, right is on our side. If we talk too much about the environment and climate change, and I'm as guilty as anybody else of doing that, we lose the audience. And I think bringing it close to the kind of concerns that people understand, and it's not just about profitability, it's about, and all those things about the better places, the more attractive places. The other thing I would say, that possibly is there deeper in the report, but possibly not in your summary, Jamie, I would say is, if you can get a couple of the big employers on board, the big city centre employers. I mean, think about Edinburgh or Glasgow. You've got Standard Life, something like 5,000 employees in the city centre. In Glasgow, again, there's that area just near the Clyde where there's loads of big corporates and big sets of employers. Look at Dublin, where you've got just close to the Liffey on the east side of the city, where Google headquarters, Accenture headquarters are all based. That has been very influential, and Dublin's by no means an exemplary, but in terms of active travel, for example, it's just amazing to see the cycling levels. So I think if you can get them on board from a health and well-being perspective, and of course there's an excellent website, Way to Work, which employers should be directed towards, which gives you loads of tips and ideas on reducing, encouraging travels to employees to travel to work in an active and sustainable way. And yeah, I think that they're the main things that I would say that I think can make a difference. I know in Sustrans we took the decision a couple of years ago to work with the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce and sponsoring the it was an active and healthy employer. It was one of their Glasgow Business Awards. And that was because we had a lot of work going on in Glasgow. And there had been quite persistent opposition, not just from individual businesses, but from the Chamber of Commerce. But through that, we got a couple of good example workplaces that they won the award, and we're happy to talk about how they had won the award for active and healthy travel. And then I think getting to a point where, I don't know if anybody from the Chamber is here on this call, but where you have the Chief Executive, Stuart Patrick, mentioning in a meeting, talking about urban realm. I think that's an amazing gain. I mean, he was on the Glasgow Commission as well, but the Connectivity Commission, but that's an example of little bits of changes that can make a really big difference. And I think that's something that we have to think about. So who are our thought leader advocates, I suppose, in the business community that can tell the story for us? And yeah, just not being convinced, that being less evangelistic, and I'd be the first to put my hand up on that too.
Fantastic. Thank you, Claire, for your thoughts there. I think that's a really interesting point you mentioned about bringing in a wide range of groups in order to get as much support for projects such as car-free cities as possible. I think that was also mentioned by Gareth and was in the report. So I think, yeah, definitely good to think about that. So I'd like to now invite Lesley to give some more thoughts on this.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'm, as was mentioned at the top of the meeting, I'm the convener for transport in Edinburgh, which means I'm the political lead on transport and the environment in the city. I first of all wanted to say thank you very much indeed to Jamie for that report. I had the enormous privilege of visiting Oslo a couple of years ago and meeting with some of the council officers, city officials, and the politicians involved in this project. And I see so much of what I saw in Oslo in Jamie's report. And I also see a lot of the lessons that we took from that trip. And I've tried to incorporate in some of what we've been doing here in Edinburgh. And I suppose what I want to do is try and really relate our experience in Edinburgh to some of the lessons that Jamie has drawn out from his particular report. So I'd like to touch on a couple of key projects that we've got underway at the moment. One of those is the city centre transformation. Now, it's a very big title and it covers a lot, but it is a prime example where what we've done is taken a very long-term view. This is a 10-year programme that we're looking at, and said to ourselves, what is it that we need to do about the city centre, both to make it a place that people want to be in, a place for relaxation, a place for accessibility, in improving the sense of equality in our city by making it much more accessible in all sorts of ways, but also as a backdrop to a thriving economic centre as well. And so we've put an enormous amount of work into that. Some of the progress on it has been slightly delayed by the pandemic, of course, as is happening across all sorts of fields. But we're looking very closely at some of the key projects that could sit within that city centre transformation. Some of those centre on changing how we deliver people into the city centres, in other words, the transport infrastructure that sits around it. Some of it is about placemaking, making sure that the environment for people in that setting is conducive to making people want to linger, to enjoy, to really spend time in the city centre, all of which, of course, has significant impact on people running businesses in the city centre. One of the planks of that has been a project called George Street in Newtown. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Edinburgh, George Street is one of our main thoroughfares in the city centre. It's a beautiful piece of classic architecture, wide street, beautiful buildings. But at the moment, all that beauty and joy and benefit is quite obscured by the fact that it essentially acts as a car park for the city centre. And so the project that we've had underway for quite some time is to look at completely revamping that city centre street with all the consequent knock-on effects elsewhere, and essentially pedestrianising it, introducing cycles into the area and very much reduced vehicle traffic, reduced really to those who have disabled access and 1 or 2 taxi facilities. One of the really interesting parts of that is that it's been years in the making, and we're still going through the whole process at the moment. But what our city officers have tried to do is to engage very closely with the business community, and that's in terms of the local business improvement district organisation. That's also in a wider sense, but it's also with the very specific businesses that are operating on that street and close by. And we've gone through a process which I suppose is a bit of a buzzword at the moment of co-production. But what we've done is we've kept going back to those businesses and kept talking to them about their specific needs, about their concerns, and about the wider vision of what we're trying to deliver. And that has got us into a pretty good place on that particular project. Now, it'll be some years in its implementation, so it'll be some years before the full benefits are felt. But I think we've managed to take the business community with us quite well on that. There will be bumps along the road towards implementation. That's absolutely understandable. But I think the general principle around that consultation and direct contact has been a really useful aspect of that particular project. The other project I want to talk about sits slightly outside the city centre, and it's the Tram Extension works that we've got on it's a major infrastructure project, which is going out of the city centre down towards an area in Edinburgh called Leith. I want to talk to you about this for a couple of reasons. One, it illustrates, I think, the lessons that can be brought from Jamie's report, and they can be expanded across a city. So it's not just about the city centre, because I think a lot of the lessons that he was expanding on, we could equally apply to what we refer to as our 9 town centres. So those other areas around a city that have grown up around a community, a small area of shops, that kind of feel. It's where the communities in our city are based. Leith is one of those. And Leith suffered from the fact that we had a previous tram extension project which didn't ever get completed there, but they had a lot of disruption attached to some of the early works. We've now gone back in with that project to complete the tram line. And that was a project which, of course, produced a lot of real worries and concerns for businesses along that route. So what could we do to support them? Well, first of all, we did a bit of that co-production, lots of public meetings, lots of back and forth saying, this is what we're thinking about doing. What do you think of this design? Do you think it's appropriate, etc.? That covered both residential and business communication. But what we also did was something which was quite unusual in Scottish public sector terms, is that we looked at a very large business support package going in for the construction period. Inevitably, this is a long construction period. We're right in the throes of it at the moment. That we won't actually have passengers on our tram on that part of the city until 2023. So this is a long period of time for those local businesses to exist in an area where there is disruption. So we looked at a business support package which covered everything from making sure that local businesses got their windows washed regularly to prevent any impact around the construction works, right through to logistics hubs being put in place to allow easy delivery into those businesses, easy delivery for residents as well in that area, right through to all sorts of aspects around a business voucher scheme, a local shopping voucher scheme, which allowed people to access those shops and get good value for their money and driving business towards those businesses. So there's been a whole range of lessons, I think, that we've learned along the way and started to apply and are beginning now to find the success. The other thing I wanted to mention, because there's a lot I could talk about in an Edinburgh context, but I wanted to come back more to a point of principle around what was emerging. It was this question around communication. time and time again, we see in Edinburgh, and I suspect many other cities and towns, that the fear of change drives a lot of the conversation before you get to implementation. And I think we have to recognise that, and recognise that the what if question that sits at heart of business worries, residential worries about major substantial change is one that's almost impossible to answer completely before we get into implementation. But what is interesting is that once we get into implementation and people begin to see the benefits, either of the way in which we're implementing or the end result of it, a lot of that fear dissipates. And people they're free then to see the benefits that are attached to that. And I think it's about local authorities holding their nerve around that period of change of perspective from businesses and residents. The other thing I'd also say is that this is not looking just at transport or placemaking, it's also about what we do around planning laws and so on. I would reference another street in Edinburgh, Princes Street, which is one of our main shopping streets. It always has been. It looks onto our Edinburgh Castle. It's a beautiful location. But recently we've relaxed some of the planning rules around that to allow a greater presence of hospitality businesses on Princes Street. And that reflects our acknowledgement that the retail scene is changing, as it is in most city centres, and the need to both replace and re-energise that particular street through the introduction of hospitality businesses. So again, that should be seen as an opportunity for some businesses coming in and to reflect the change that's necessary in cities. There's a lot more I could comment on, but just a final congratulations to Jamie on this report. I think it's going to be one that's very useful to cities in Scotland and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, for that. I think we can see from the various projects underway as part of the city centre transformations in Edinburgh that car-free cities is certainly a very active topic. So it's so great to hear all these different perspectives from our panellists on this. We've had some great contributions, but we are running a little behind schedule. So I'll take a few questions now, and then those of you who would perhaps like to stay on with us after 12 for any further question opportunities for Jamie, who's happy to stay on for the call for a wee bit longer, then please feel free to stay, but no worries at all if not. But I was going to ask our attendees from the Oslo commune whether they had any thoughts on Jamie's report.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say congratulations to Jamie. It's well, for me particularly, it's really interesting because I'm quite new to the program, so I guess the only thing I can say is still it's a learning process, definitely, and I don't know if my good colleague Christine has something to more insight to share with you, but it's really interesting to reading your report, so congratulations.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have anything to add, but I would like to say, well, thank you to Jamie, because this really reminds us why we're working on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's great to see the project continuing as well. Real ambition, and it's great to see that going forward. Great. Thanks for those comments, guys. Yeah, definitely agree with you, Jamie. So at this point, if anyone else has any further questions you may have for the panelists, if you'd like to raise your hand. Callum, I can see you've got your hand raised there if you'd like to ask your question.
Right. So great report, Jamie. Very, very interesting findings, and I think it's really crucial for us to look at how we, when we're contemplating quite large-scale changes in city centres going forward. And I'm in Glasgow, and Glasgow is certainly, certainly in the process of actually has undertaken the first of those projects, and is in the process of undertaking further similar projects about reducing car space and so on. One thing that I wanted to raise, and I was very pleased to hear Leslie talking about it, is about those non-city centre but other key commercial spaces within larger cities. I think probably Glasgow and Edinburgh have, you know, between the two of them, have more of them than anywhere else. But I've been staying in Shawlands in the south side of Glasgow, and it's a key commercial hub for the south side of the city. And just from, I'm in a flat on Kilmarnock Road, which is the main road, and I just observe the problems that are happening day in, day out. People are parking in bus stops, people are parking in zigzags next to, and these are people who are generally delivering. So they're there, parked there a short time, but it's because the actual car parking spaces are occupied by cars, private cars, which are there for a longer time. So how do we, you know, when you're located on a key thoroughfare, I would say, what are the methods by which you actually start to look at reducing car use and car penetration in these kinds of areas where people do commute into people who work in the area do tend to commute in by car, and but then park their cars in areas which would be better used for being reserved for delivery spaces and things like that, things which would actually more directly benefit businesses around here.
I'm not sure if that question was for me, but I can give a few thoughts. And I don't pretend to be a transport planner or indeed an expert in that field. What I would say is several things. I mean, again, to reinforce the point about providing viable alternatives. So strong public transport systems are obviously absolutely vital for this. And we're talking about people commuting into work. If we look at Scottish cities, in particular Edinburgh and Glasgow, there's obviously a very kind of big distance that people commute from. So thinking about what regional or more local public transport options there are. In terms of the issues around parking you identified, I'd say something that Oslo actually does fairly well, or from what I could tell when I was there, is they have quite good parking garages located in the right places. So I think having making sure that those parking garages are obviously located in the right places and making sure that they're well connected with public transport, so people don't feel like they have to drive right into the city centre to actually, still access the city centre, very important. On your point about people parking in delivery spaces, I think you have to look at enforcement and make sure that there's the right level of enforcement in place to deter that. And in terms of deliveries, I would say logistics hubs and making sure that there's reduced need for a lot of delivery vehicles going into the city. And again, that's something that Oslo has done pretty well as well. That would be my thoughts on your question.
Great. Just before we take our next question, I would just like to say at this point, which as it is 12, and I appreciate that people might be needing to head off at the moment, and just like to say a really massive thank you to everyone for their contributions, and especially to Jamie for his fantastic and informative presentation, as well to other speakers, of course, Gareth, Leslie, and Cllr, you coming along to this event. I think that Edinburgh and Glasgow and other cities at this moment are actively working on measures to bring about similar changes, what we've heard in Jamie's report. So I think it's fair to say that car-free cities is clearly a very active topic, as already said, but in Scottish politics at the moment. So I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about it with this meeting. But for now, yeah, if you want to stay on the call, please feel free, and we'll carry on with some more questions and answers. But if not, then please have a lovely weekend, and I hope you've found this an informative event. Cheers. And Dave, if you'd like to ask your question now. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, thanks very much for the report, Jamie. In terms of gaining business support, there's a couple of issues that come into my head, and I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts or if there's any experience from Norway. One is that there's many different types of businesses, you know, and some will need a lot more in the way of deliveries and big deliveries, like a furniture business, for example, whereas others will be very different to that. How does that impact on gaining business support? And then the second issue is out of town shopping. I'm not sure what the situation in Norway is, but again, city centre businesses may well be worried about losing trade to out-of-town shopping. So could you just give a few thoughts on how gaining business support can be achieved in those contexts? Thank you.
Yeah, really good questions, Dave. I'll touch on your second point first. So I think it's a very, very important thing that we need to consider, this aspect of out-of-town shopping. And indeed, it was something that was raised from a couple of business stakeholders that I spoke to about this risk or this threat of out-of-town shopping negatively impacting the city centre. So I don't have any real solutions there. What I would say is there needs to be a joined up approach and kind of within the wider national and regional policy actions to try to discourage things like that. I think if we do want to create these vibrant and successful city centres, you do need an approach where you're not going to just shift everyone to the outskirts of the city and thereby encouraging further car use. On your first point about the need to accommodate for different types of businesses, it's a very good point, and I think there is differences between the different types of business. So in my review of the literature that was kind of been done on this topic, I think in general, restaurants and cafes and hotels and places like that, they tend to be very supportive of these things because it creates a nicer space to spend time in. There is a bit of nuance in other businesses, definitely. And something I found was perhaps like speciality shops or very niche shops might find it harder to kind of adapt, or they might not see as many benefits as other cases. So for example, one business I spoke to was, I'll give two examples here. So firstly, there was a furniture shop right in the middle of downtown Oslo who was very, very opposed to this project. And I think it's fair enough to be opposed, but I think you have to recognize that the nature of city centres is changing, and it's probably not very suitable to have a shop like a bed shop or something right in the middle of downtown Oslo. I think another case which was highlighted was a very niche shop, and I think they were selling some types of special, very niche shoes, and people would come from a great distance to access this shop, and that would be done by car, and it was quite an expensive shop, so people, more likely to use their car on higher incomes. So in cases like that, it's obvious that you need to recognize that difference between different businesses. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I agree with your approach of needing to treat different businesses differently to accommodate for those differences.
If I could just come back very quickly on the out of town, I'm wondering if there's any kind of legislation or rules in Oslo or Norway that might encourage city centre rather than out of town. Because in Britain, in Scotland rather, when the government introduced the workplace parking levy, Transform and Spokes and others campaigned for this to be extended to large customer parking, and the government refused to do that. I don't know if there's any scope for that to be campaigned on again and whether it would be worthwhile. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's probably a question for Transform rather than myself. That's kind of outside the scope.
Colin, do you want to respond to that, or else we could take Gary's question as well? I see you've got your hand raised there.
So I think, Dave, yeah, certainly it's something that we are have an interest in, but it's not really the focus of today's call. So I think I'd prefer to keep a wee bit more on agenda. So I suggest, Rachel, you go to Gary.
Yeah, great. We'll head to Gary for his question.
Hi there. Yeah, I think probably in the same lines as Dave about different business types. So I suppose a couple of points there. I mean, obviously quite a substantial focus, and some of the examples used there have been retail, but even in a city like Edinburgh, retail accounts for maybe 10 to 12% of the businesses in the city. And looking at the report, it's talking about a slight economic benefit over time. So I'm intrigued to know how we can sell benefits to multiple types of businesses, not just retail businesses or hospitality businesses. How do we get them all in? How do we provide that evidence of future economic prosperity for all these different types of businesses? And I think illustrative of that challenge is the point you just made about, you know, having to go to some businesses who've maybe been established for 10, 20, 50, 100 years and say, I'm sorry, your business is no longer suitable. That's a big challenge, to go to a business that's maybe been in a family for generations and suddenly telling them, no, you're not welcome here. And we've seen examples of that. In, you know, Lesley mentioned the tram scheme in Edinburgh. One of our members had been sort of automotive trade, had been based in Constitution Street for many, many years and was forced out, and they've gone somewhere else. So I think there's a lot of good stuff in there, and I think I agree completely with the report when it talks about getting that buy-in as early as possible stage and having proper dialogue and engagement between local businesses and the local authority. But yeah, it's about a lot more than retail. And are there any examples from Oslo in terms of how that's worked?
No, certainly good questions. I think firstly to reflect on maybe your point about businesses being forced out or you know, like an adapt or die situation. I don't see it as extreme as that. I think one of the things I heard in Oslo was the example of a trip they did to Brussels, whereby they spoke to a business in the city centre who was quite niche. I can't remember exactly what it was, something like furniture. So something which is, you know, if you were having to get people to come to you by car to pick up a bit of furniture, obviously not suited for reducing car access. But what they'd done is they'd adapted and they'd found new ways of doing things. So yes, people still came to the shop to think, okay, what do I want to buy? But they didn't have to take it home with them. So they had a same-day delivery service, in fact, whereby people could go to the shop, decide what they wanted to buy, and then they could go home and that would be delivered on the same day. So I think there needs to be quite an honest conversation about everyone needing to be kind of willing to make changes where possible and having the local authority support them in doing so as well. On your point about different types of businesses, I think certainly a good point, very important to recognise it's not all about retail. Maybe you could just quickly come in with what other types of businesses you were specifically talking about. Is it kind of office space and that sort of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. And obviously, you know, looking at, we're now in the COVID situation, you know, 20-minute neighbourhoods is obviously very prevalent now. To what extent will businesses go back to working the way they did? But you know, it's not always just about office. It's not always just about retail. I mean, there's other types of businesses, maybe more even sort of manufacturing type businesses within a city centre area. You know, that's particularly true of some cities in particular. So how do we recognise that diversity and find solutions for everyone, and crucially be able to engage with all of these different types of businesses in the way that those businesses need to be engaged in order to take it forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think having that nuance is really important and making sure no one feels forgotten about or left behind. I totally agree. I mean, this perhaps isn't a direct answer to your question, but I think we can find ways of doing things differently, which work for a very wide range of businesses. So one of the favorite interviews I did in Oslo was, I think they were a plumbing firm, and they had completely got on board with this project. So they had changed all their diesel vans to electric vans. And because of the costs associated with that, they hadn't replaced all their diesel vans. They'd got rid of them, and what they'd done instead was get electric cargo bikes. And the guy was like absolutely raving about it. He was so on board with it. And it was just fantastic to see a business like that, where on the face of it, you would think, how on earth are they going to adapt? But they'd done very, very well. I think, in fact, it was a carpentry business. So I think there needs to be a willingness to adapt. I think it's also important to remember, although we're talking about car free, I really regret using that term, because these schemes they're not car free. They're not, and there is still limited, car access available, particularly for businesses in there if they need to access those shops. deliveries, that sorts of thing. So there are exceptions that can be made. It's about, you know, reducing as much as possible, but not banning. I think we still need to recognise, as you said, that some businesses will perhaps still need that. So
I suppose that's like a communication problem in itself, the car-free cities. Yeah, interesting to think about that. David Hanson, would you like to ask your question? I see your hand's raised.
Yes, as somebody who was born in Oslo and lived there until I was 6, so it was a really interesting presentation. But my question is about what, if any, effect has this had on the rest of the city? Because that map is obviously very much the centre of Oslo, even the larger map later on. And obviously Oslo has car tunnels running underneath it, and a maelstrom of motorways and things round about. So has this had any effect on the rest of just the surroundings of Oslo? Let alone obviously the rest of Norway, it's not going to have much effect. But I just wondered whether this had any effect on the surrounding area of just of Oslo, or whether it's just become, as in places like Amsterdam can be at times, where there's a very nice, pretty centre, but the rest of it looks pretty much the same. I mean, I do know that there are lots of electric cars in Norway, but that doesn't mean that the other problems of cars have been changed.
Yeah, very important point as well. We don't want the city centre to benefit at the expense of other areas, for sure. The answer to that is I don't know for sure. It's been a while since I did this research. I know it's something that the local authority was monitoring, and they were keen to understand what effects there might be on other areas of the city. So certainly really important to consider that. And as you said, Oslo benefits from tunnels under the parts of the city, and that's obviously something we don't really do to a great extent in some Scottish cities. What I would say, as you kind of highlighted, they've done things like electric cars to tackle some of the problems associated with cars. They also have quite an extensive toll system, which has been a point of opposition and has, in fact, even caused a political party to spring up as a result, focusing on that sole issue. So they're trying to do other things to reduce car use in and around cities more widely. So yeah, I unfortunately don't have a strong answer for your question about the impact for the wider parts of the city, but I know it's something the local authority was focusing on.
Great. I was just going to bring in Emma at this point, who's actually joining us from Trondheim in Norway.
Yeah, it's not the original question I was going to ask, but it's a different one. Were there any incentives for the business owners to change their practices? So, for example, you know, the carpentry business you mentioned, and they changed to cargo bikes. Was there any kind of financial incentive to help them do that, or any other kind of, yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, a good point. And yes, there was. So there was that in place for e-bikes and e-cargo bikes. I think specifically for businesses, but I think possibly for just regular people as well. So that's obviously really important to kind of support that transition and actually, yeah, help people along the way and, as you say, incentivize. There was also measures for cafes and restaurant businesses, or even for regular retail businesses, making it easier to use the street space outside their shops to kind of encourage that kind of attractive environment and making use of this newfound space that they actually had outside their shops. So I know there was measures. I think there was actually a problem with introducing that because of some EU legislation, I think. So maybe that's one of the benefits of leaving the EU. Now we can do that, but one of the only benefits. But no, so I think there were some issues with actually implementing that, and some businesses weren't actually aware that that was even on offer. So again, it comes back to communication and making sure that businesses are aware of what measures are actually available. So.
Great, thanks, Jamie. You're doing very well with answering all these questions. So we've had a number of people from Dundee City Council on the call, and I just wondered if they might have any comments on the Scottish experience from beyond Edinburgh and Glasgow on this. Feel free, whoever.
Thanks very much. I'll take that one, Rachel. It's very ambitious. It's certainly it's the direction of travel which I think all Scottish cities want to be travelling in. Sorry, I should have said I'm Ewan McNaughton, the head of Sustainable Transport and Roads at Dundee City Council. There are challenges around it, and it's great actually the presentations today and the comments as well that there have been balanced and have recognised the challenges as well, and not shied away from them, and the work effort that's needed on board of having these compromises to get these things through. From Dundee's point of view, we're looking at again, there's comparabilities to Oslo. Oslo's it benefits, I think, from the same city centre structure, albeit larger, as we have in Dundee. Dundee's got some advantages in terms of we've got a very good outer ring or inner ring, as we call it, road system with some strategically sited multi-storey car parks. We've also got a smaller city centre with a lower population, so it's population in Dundee is about 125,000, and comparatively the city centre is smaller, so it is more walkable, if you like. But yeah, the greatest challenges I think are going to be the on-street parking, particularly the businesses, and just the general change. Again, Dundee's got some advantages on that. We've got a very low car use population internally within the city, and as I say, we're structured quite well. Yeah, so we're moving forward with our plans for it, but it is a journey and it does take time.
Thank you, Ewan, on that. I think with that, we'll round up the event today. Thanks again to everyone who stayed on the call up until this point. And yeah, thanks again to all of our speakers and to Jamie for answering those extra questions there. And yeah, we'll be posting a recording of the event on our website after this afternoon or on Monday, and you'll be able to review it there, or I'll send it along to anyone who maybe wasn't able to join today but was interested in the topic, which is a very interesting one I think we can all agree on. Thank you very much, guys, and have a lovely weekend, and we hope to see you at our future events soon. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.